Hello, welcome back to Chapter 14, Part 3, or is it 4? Either way. So, in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the collapse of communism in Russia and Eastern Europe, there was a lot of talk about how the world would change, what was going to be taking shape. For the last 60, 70 years, the dominant organizing force had been the United States versus the Soviet Union, communism versus capitalism. Samuel Huntington wrote a book called The Clash of Civilizations. He said that the next big thing, it wasn't going to be about politics. It was going to be more about these long, deep held lines based on culture, history, religion. And he broke the world into these 9 types of groups. So the Western world, which was Europe and the United States and Australia. The Orthodox world, which was Russia and Greece and the former Eastern Europe. The Islamic world, and other types of groups. And he said that these groupings that were based on religion and shared culture and a history, they were going to be more important. And that was the next basic role of governmental organization. Okay, drew heavy criticisms. For the one thing, the world is not so easily divided. Okay, so the Muslim world is a very large area, but within this are several smaller variations. In other words, the Muslim world is not the same as it is here in Morocco as it is in Pakistan. And a great example of that is the Arab Spring. In 2011, a wave of revolutions swept through the Arab world. Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, Yemen, Bahrain, all these countries, but different reactions. In Tunisia, it works out into a change of government to a democracy. In Libya, the country has descended into anarchy, and there are 3 different national governments. Yemen became a bloody civil war and a cold war, in a sense, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And Syria is still being figured out right now. In other words, some areas were more democratic than others. So, according to Huntington, that shouldn't happen. They should have all had the same response. We know from our own experience that there's been this distancing in many ways between the United States and much of Europe in the last 4 to 5 years. So when we look at this, what they call the New World Order, right? Since the Cold War, there's been 4 big trends. And the first one is that we are the only global superpower. And what do I mean by that? We are the leader of the world militarily and economically, even though it costs a lot. So look at this. When you look at how much money is spent every year on guns and tanks and ships and submarines, of all the money in the world, 45% of that is spent by the US. We spend more on our military than the next 14 countries. All these countries combined equal what we spend. So between that and that, the rest of the world only spends 15%. There's a reason why we have the biggest military in the world, because we spend the most money on it. We are one of the only countries that can truly put our Army, our Navy, our Air Force pretty much anywhere we want on a moment's notice. We have aircraft carriers, we have nuclear submarines, we even have a brand new Space Force, right? So China has a big army, United Kingdom, France, but not even close. And the other aspect is that even though it's changing, we are still the largest economy. If you measure this factor called gross domestic product, you measure all the goods we make, all the goods we sell, all the economic activity in the world, 24% of that is us. The next biggest is China. So even though China is growing, we are still by far the largest single economic actor in the world. Those 2 alone give us that unique status. The second trend is the rise of mutual security and defense organizations. So today, NATO in Europe has expanded. In 1990, NATO consisted of the United States, Canada, and these countries in Europe. And its primary mission was to act as a counterweight to the Soviet Union and communist Eastern Europe. It was a mutual defense grouping. Well, after communism falls, and several of these countries are no longer communist, and in fact Germany becomes one country again, NATO's role changes. And you can see right here under my picture, all these former countries here are now part of NATO. And NATO's role is more about a European peacekeeping mission. We see rise of the use of United Nations peacekeepers. So the UN sends peacekeeper troops to these areas right now to help on missions, maybe between different states. And we see other types of security alliances. So this is NATO, but there is the African Union, which is very active in policing the continent. South America, the countries of South America have the South American Defense Corps. So we see this rise. Third trend is that even though we are still the only superpower, we are not the only source of power. We're seeing rising actors on the stage, besides Russia reemerging as a somewhat dominant power, but mainly China. And why is that? Well, one, as I showed you before, it's the second largest economy in the world, right? Up until the 1980s, China was not considered a major economic player. But as they opened up their laws about trading and began to trade with the rest of the world, with that liberalization of trade, they needed more raw materials. And so what they have done is China has used its money more than its military to gain influence. These dots represent the amount of foreign investment in a country that is Chinese. So Ecuador in South America, of all the money invested in Ecuador that is not from people who are Ecuadorian, 57% of the foreign investment is Chinese alone. In Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe, Afghanistan, it's 70 to 80%. So why is that important? Well, in Zimbabwe, for instance, if the country wants to build a new railroad and they can't afford it, they would go to China and ask to borrow the money. China says, that's fine, but here's the deal. We'll give you the money, but we want to be able to use the railroad to go to this diamond mine first. So they get access to raw materials. When it comes time to support China in a conflict, or if China wants something, these countries are going to be a little bit more beholden to them, right? Think about it. If you owe money to your mother or to your father, you tend to listen to them a lot more than if you don't, right? Now, along with that, they also have their version of the World Bank, the Asian Bank. Another way to get lending. They have built their military, but China isn't focusing on competing with us as a world power. They're really focused on building up their regional power. And so all these stars represent either military or commercial ports where the Chinese government has negotiated a deal. They call it the Chinese string of pearls because most of Chinese oil comes from the Middle East. So they want to protect that route. And Africa is a huge source of raw materials for their factories, for their industry. So for instance, here in Sri Lanka, they negotiated a deal with the government to build the Hambantota container port, a very large port. But in exchange for paying for most of the construction, they also get the first right of ships docking there. So their ships get preferential treatment, and they are also allowed to dock their military ships there as well. Now, Chinese economy has been growing at the fastest rate of any world economic systems in the last 20 years. Very high growth, but it's been very difficult to maintain. And one of the problems is, as your economy grows, so do your wages. People are paid more. But just like in our country, not everybody is going up at the same time. So look at this. China is about 56% urban. So 56% of their population live in cities, and mainly here in the east, right? Now, when you look at your average income for a family in China, and you take away the money you spend on rent and food and medicine, what's left? Disposable income. In these rural areas in the country, the per capita disposable income, how much money is there for fun, for shopping? $1,700. But look at the cities, $4,600. People in the cities are becoming wealthier much faster at a much higher rate, and it's mainly concentrated here in the east. Over here are large areas that are very vastly poor, rural, and there's a lot of ethnic minorities as well. And that exposes another factor. Not everybody in Chinese is ethnically Chinese. If you think about the Chinese language, that is called the Han Chinese culture. It is predominantly based here in the eastern half of China. This part of China, only 6% of the population is Han. Most of the population here is Tibetan or Uyghur or Turk, ethnically not Chinese. And a lot of them are very actively working not to be part of China. So you have not only inequality in wealth, but an inequality in political representation. In a lot of these large cities in the West, the Chinese government will send in Chinese to run the city and run the businesses. And at the meantime, a lot of the poorer minorities are being forced into re-education camps. Okay? Other countries are reacting to China's rise. I think the rise of the Chinese economy was one of the direct things that President Trump ran on. He kept on talking about how much we had to worry about China and world trade. So other countries are responding to that. Some countries are seeking out Chinese trade actively, and some are trying to discourage it. The last element of this New World Order is the rise of non-state actors. So things that aren't countries. So think of terrorism and Al-Qaeda. Right? Al-Qaeda begins as a global terrorist organization in several countries. They were responsible for the attacks on the Twin Towers at 9/11. They have bombed U.S. embassies in Africa. They've sent suicide missions towards U.S. warships, and they were fighting in Afghanistan after the first Gulf War. And their, focus was to promote a fundamentalist, anti-Western, purely Muslim view that not even everybody who is Muslim believes in. Very, very, very offshore and strict, and is still considered a very dangerous part of the world order. There are terrorists all over the world still. ISIS actually begins as a branch of Al-Qaeda that goes even further to be very, very, very fundamental anti-non-Muslim. And they arise here as the state of Syria descends into civil war. And what makes them different is that they actually take over territory. They go from being a non-state actor, a terrorist organization, to at one point controlling half of Iraq and almost all of Syria. They were technically, in everything but name, for a brief period of time, a state. Now, partially because Iraq was falling apart because we had invaded it. It was in bad shape. Syria has a civil war. Once those things clear up and other countries get involved to stamp them out, they basically shrunk back down, and they are no longer have any territory. They're back to being a non-state actor. But there are multiple branches around the world with Al-Qaeda or ISIS branches. And where do they get the people that do this? A lot of the people who fight for these terrorist organizations, right? They are Muslim youth, and the best example is I can see this. There were a lot of people from Europe in ISIS. So a lot of refugees fled the Middle East during the 80s and 90s and went to go live in other countries like France or Germany. And they were there, and while they were there, they faced persecution, they faced discrimination. Even though they were supposedly in a safe place, they realized that they were never truly free. And in these other countries back in the Middle East, there's a lot of repression, a lot of political dictatorships. So if you're young, you don't see a path forward. You can never truly be independent, and you're never going to truly live in a free country or have an opportunity to make a good life for yourself. It makes it very attractive to join these groups that basically proclaim that's what they're trying to do, is overthrow the establishment. So there's an old saying that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. All right, I'm going to pause this video here. We're going to come back in the last bit with the last bit of the chapter, so just hang on.